A peaceful morning was disrupted when two police officers, Taylor Smith and Chris Brown, suddenly closed in and arrested a black man named Michael Jordan right in the middle of a bustling neighborhood. Without any explanation or clear justification, their actions caused confusion and outrage among the onlookers. However, what no one could have anticipated was the true identity of Michael Jordan, a revelation that would leave the entire police department reeling. The city center began its day in the usual rush. Towering skyscrapers cast long shadows across the streets, the sounds of honking cars and animated conversations blending into a symphony of urban life. Within this vibrant scene, Michael Jordan walked with an air of calm and confidence. In his early 30s, he was dressed in a flawlessly tailored suit, his polished leather shoes producing a rhythmic click on the pavement. Without seeking attention, he naturally drew glances from passersby thanks to his commanding presence and distinctive demeanor. Michael had just left a small, familiar diner where he was a regular every morning. The staff there knew him well and always served a perfect breakfast: golden fried eggs, fragrant turkey, crispy bacon strips, and a side of fresh fruit. A faint smile appeared on his lips as he adjusted the cuff of his crisp white shirt, a simple yet elegant gesture. His sleek black car was parked nearby, ready to take him to another busy day. But today was unlike any other. The encounter with the two officers triggered a chain of unforeseeable events, culminating in the revelation of Michael's true identity. The police department found itself facing not only a lawsuit, but also a tidal wave of public outcry and demands for justice. Michael Jordan was far from an ordinary man. He was a symbol of defiance, a powerful reminder that discrimination and injustice cannot persist indefinitely. Michael felt the familiar, faint vibration of his phone in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from his mother flash on the screen, a gentle reminder about the family dinner that evening. He smiled, replying briefly that he remembered and was looking forward to it. For Michael, family had always been his most important foundation. He made his way to the car parked by the curb, preparing to unlock it, but immediately sensed something unusual. Two police officers were approaching, their eyes locked onto him. Their expressions were hard to read, but the intensity in their gaze made Michael feel uneasy. Michael had grown up with his father's lessons on how to handle encounters with police. Stay calm, be polite, and under no circumstances provoke them. He understood that in situations like this, composure was the key to survival. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out loudly as they drew closer. Michael turned to face them, his phone still in hand. "Yes, officers?" he replied, his voice steady and composed. The officer with the badge reading Taylor Smith met his eyes and responded without a greeting. "May I see your identification?" His partner, Chris Brown, stood a step behind, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. Michael took a deep breath, maintaining his calm demeanor. "May I ask why?" he responded, polite yet firm, drawing a clear boundary. His father's lessons echoed in his mind: de-escalate, but don't relinquish your rights. But Michael understood his rights. He had done nothing wrong, and he knew they had no valid reason to demand his identification. Lisa fixed her gaze on him, curling her lip in a gesture laced with challenge. "Show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." Michael stared at Taylor for a moment, his patience palpable, thickening the tension in the air. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket. "All right," he said as he pulled out his wallet. "But I'd still like to know the reason for this request." As he handed his driver's license to Taylor Smith, he noticed Chris Brown shifting slightly in the background, as if preparing for something. A wave of tension rippled through the atmosphere, but Michael kept his composure. Taylor took the license, glancing at it briefly, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, his tone accusatory. Michael raised an eyebrow, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. "I'm just heading to my car. Is there a problem?" Taylor ignored the question and pressed on. "Where are you coming from?" "I had breakfast at the diner down the street," Michael replied, maintaining his calm. "As I said, is there an issue here?" Taylor's eyes flicked over Michael, betraying a fleeting flicker of annoyance. "We've received reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said. The faint smirk on his lips clashing with the gravity of the situation Michael had faced that morning. "And you happen to match the description of someone we're looking for." Michael's stomach tightened as the weight of the encounter began to settle on him. The stakes of this confrontation were becoming all too clear. Lisa handed back Michael's ID absent-mindedly, but not without reiterating, "We received reports of suspicious activity in this area, and you fit the description of the person we're looking for." A sly smirk flickered across his face, fanning the flames of doubt and tension. Michael's stomach tightened, a familiar sensation like a door closing in front of him. He understood all too well what the description meant. A black man in an affluent neighborhood, neatly dressed, but still perceived as a threat. "I see," Michael replied carefully. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. I'm here to pick up my car and head to work." Lisa seemed unfazed, taking a step closer, his stance growing more aggressive. "What do you do for work?" he asked, his tone sharp and probing. "I'm a lawyer," Michael said, his voice calm but with an edge of firmness. "I have a meeting in an hour, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way." Michael's response caught Lisa off guard. The smirk vanished from his face in an instant. "A lawyer, huh?" he repeated, as if to confirm. Chris Brown, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "You're sure you're not hiding anything?" he asked, his gaze drifting toward Michael's car parked by the curb. "Anything legal in your vehicle we should know about?" Michael felt the tension rise, spreading like a wave through the space around them. He knew how situations like this could escalate quickly. His voice remained steady but firm. "No, I'm not hiding anything. If you'd like, you're welcome to take a look." Chris Brown nodded, but there was no mistaking the skepticism in his expression. Lisa made no move, but his eyes were locked on Michael, as though testing the limits of his composure. Michael could feel the tension rising, and his father's voice echoed in his mind, a steady reminder. "Stay calm. Be wise." "There's nothing illegal in my car, officers. You're welcome to check, but I hope we're not wasting time. I have work to get to," he said calmly. Despite his composed tone, his heart pounded with an underlying dread. Lisa's sharp gaze locked onto Michael, his tone stern. "You don't dictate how we work," he said curtly. "Step away from the vehicle." Michael hesitated for a moment. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the situation was growing increasingly tense. Deciding to comply in hopes of avoiding further escalation, he raised his hand slowly and said, "All right, I'll cooperate." Carefully, he stepped away from the car, maintaining a composed exterior despite the unease gnawing at him. Lisa approached and gestured for Michael to keep his distance. "Step back," he said firmly. Michael complied without protest, moving as instructed. The officers continued their inspection of the situation, their body language reflecting heightened vigilance. Michael remained calm, breathing steadily and focusing on staying composed. Though frustration and unease simmered beneath the surface, he stayed silent, understanding the importance of handling the situation without resistance. Michael stared at Lisa as he felt the cold steel of handcuffs tightening around his wrists. "Hey, what are you doing?" he protested, his voice calm but strained from the pain in his shoulder. He wasn't resisting, yet he was being treated as though he'd committed a serious crime. Lisa looked at him with a cold, unyielding expression. "You don't make the decisions here," he said icily, tightening the cuffs further. Michael's mind swirled with indignation. He had complied from the beginning, yet it seemed these officers had made up their minds about him the moment they laid eyes on him. Across the street, Mrs. Agnes Carter, an elderly woman living in a nearby apartment building, watched in horror from her balcony. She recognized Michael, the polite young man she often saw in the neighborhood. "What are you doing to him?" she shouted, her voice trembling with outrage. "He hasn't done anything wrong." A young couple walking their dog nearby also stopped to observe. The man quickly pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is unbelievable," he muttered to his partner. "They're arresting him for no reason." Michael caught sight of the phone recording, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe this footage would help him later. Perhaps it would show the world what really happened. But for now, he remained powerless, letting the officers hoist him back to his feet. He knew he had to stay calm, stay focused. Michael took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully to avoid giving them any excuse to escalate the situation further. As the officers led him toward the police car, the crowd around them continued to grow. The voices of protest grew louder, and more phones were raised, their cameras forming a sea of glowing lights. Michael could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze, their outrage, palpable in the air. Despite the humiliation, he drew strength from their presence, holding on to the hope that the truth would come to light. Here's the English translation, rendered with accuracy and a sense of emotion to capture the original tone. The air grew tense as a shout rang out from across the street. "That's not right. He didn't do anything." A man cried out, but Lisov and Chris Brown ignored him. Their eyes grew colder, filled with determination, as they shoved Michael into the back seat of the patrol car and slammed the door shut. As the car began to pull away, Michael turned his head to look outside through the glass window. Outside, the crowd remained gathered, their faces painted with confusion, anger, and worry. Each gaze struck him like a heavy blow, and he felt a deep force stirring within his chest. Defiance. Taking a deep breath, he stared through the blurry glass. He knew he had to say something, even if it was just a few words. "This isn't over," Michael said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension, clear and sharp as it carried through the thick barrier. "This is far from over." His words lingered in the air, like a declaration amidst the chaos. As the patrol car drove off, the crowd outside stood rooted in shock, as though a fleeting dream had suddenly turned into a nightmare. Inside the car, Michael's mind churned with thoughts. What would happen next? How would he prove his innocence? He knew he would have to fight, against all odds, to ensure that justice would prevail. Outside, the crowd swelled larger, their voices of protest growing louder and more distinct. In that brief moment, Michael felt he was no longer alone. A battle for justice had begun. The police station, with its cold gray walls and glaring fluorescent lights, felt like an entirely different world compared to the lively streets outside. The noise of conversations, ringing phones, and hurried footsteps heightened the tense atmosphere that blanketed the station. Quiet glances, curt exchanges, and the occasional slamming of desks added to the rigid and fast-paced environment. Michael Jordan was escorted inside, his hands still cuffed behind his back. Lisov and Chris Brown walked on either side of him, their faces impassive, making it impossible to discern what they were thinking. As they passed the booking area, a few officers glanced up, their eyes filled with skepticism. It was clear Michael didn't fit the typical profile of suspects they usually dealt with, a well-dressed black man exuding a calm and distinctive presence. Lisa issued a brief command, guiding Michael to a desk. Behind it sat a middle-aged officer with a weathered, time-worn face, his arms bearing the marks of long years on the job. The officer glanced up at Michael for a brief moment before quickly turning his attention to the screen in front of him. "Name?" he asked in a bored tone, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Michael Jordan." Lisa replied before Michael could speak. The officer's fingers moved swiftly over the keys as he entered the name into the system. His eyes flicked across the screen, his brow furrowing slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, he gestured for Lisa to take Michael to the fingerprinting area. "Let's get this over with quickly," Lisa muttered under her breath as she nudged Michael forward. Michael maintained his composure, but deep inside he knew this wasn't going to end easily. Michael didn't resist. He knew better than to give them any reason to escalate the situation. As they took his fingerprints, he remained silent. His mind raced. He couldn't believe this was happening. Michael knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but now he was being treated like a criminal. Even so, he knew he needed to stay calm and think clearly. After the fingerprinting was complete, Lisov and Chris Brown escorted Michael to a small holding cell at the back of the station. The cell was cramped, with a narrow bench running along the wall and a metal toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant, mixed with a sour, unpleasant odor. They uncuffed Michael and shoved him inside. "Make yourself comfortable, Jenkins," one of the other officers sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. "You might be here for a while." Michael sat down on the bench, taking a deep breath. He didn't respond. He knew there was no point in engaging. They were trying to provoke him, to get him to lose his composure and give them an excuse. But Michael wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He reminded himself, calmness is the strongest weapon in this situation. What happens next depends on his patience and clarity of thought. Lisov and Chris Brown walked away, exchanging a look that spoke of a familiar understanding. They had completed their task, bringing in another troublemaker, and now they could move on to the next job. But Lisov couldn't shake a lingering sense of discomfort. He couldn't quite explain it, but the way Michael handled the situation had left an impression. The calmness, the confidence, it didn't align with the image of the suspects they usually dealt with. Think he's a lawyer or something? Jenkins mocked as they headed back to their desks. Probably just another punk dressed up in fancy clothes, right? Lisov muttered something under his breath, but his mind was elsewhere. A part of him felt unsettled. There was something about Michael that didn't add up, though he couldn't pinpoint what it was. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the doubt. It didn't matter. They had a warrant, and they'd followed orders. That was all there was to it. But as they reached the desk, a young officer, Andrew Clark, quietly observed them. New to the force and lacking much experience, Andrew's sharp eyes reflected a keen attention to detail. As Lisov and Chris Brown turned their backs, Andrew stepped closer, glancing over the documents on the desk. "What happened to him?" Andrew asked, his tone cautious. Among the crowd of critics and skeptics, Andrew's meticulous curiosity was a rare distinction. A few months ago, Andrew Clark had eagerly set out to prove himself at work, earning praise for his intelligence and keen attention to detail. Yet the senior officers often made him hesitate, questioning whether his insights would be taken seriously. "Taylor Smith," Andrew Clark called softly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Lisov glanced at him, his brows furrowing. "What is it?" Andrew hesitated by glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "The man you just brought in, Michael Jordan. I think I know who he is." Lisov frowned deeper. "What are you talking about?" Andrew leaned in closer, lowering his voice even further. "I saw him in an article a few weeks ago. He's not just a lawyer. He's a civil rights attorney, a pretty prominent one. He's been involved in some big, high-profile cases." For a moment, Lisov's eyes widened, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Are you sure about this?" Andrew nodded firmly. "At first, I didn't recognize him, but when I heard that name, it clicked. You might want to be careful with this guy. If it's really him, this situation could backfire on us." Lisov didn't respond immediately. A faint sense of unease stirred within him, but he pushed it down. This couldn't be true. They had arrested him, and the warrant was valid. What could possibly go wrong? Fairly speaking, Lisov couldn't believe Michael was someone important. However, the seed of doubt now haunted him, spreading like ripples in his mind. "I'll handle it," Lisov said curtly, waving Andrew Clark away. Yet as he turned to leave, he couldn't shake off the growing unease tightening in his chest. Andrew Clark watched Lisov walk away, then quickly pulled out his phone. Scrolling through his contacts, he stopped when he found the number he needed. Taking a deep breath, Andrew prayed he was making the right decision. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah?" "Chief, this is Andrew Clark," he said in a low, cautious voice. "We've got a situation here at the station. I think you need to know about it." Meanwhile, back in the holding cell, Michael sat quietly. His mind was focused, running through the events that had unfolded. He was certain this was about more than just him. This was part of a larger issue. He had become a target, that much was clear, but the reason remained a mystery. Waiting in silence, Michael steadied his nerves. He had been through worse, and he knew he would get through this too. An hour passed without any incident. Then the door to the cell opened, and a woman stepped inside. Stepping inside, she appeared to be in her early 30s, her sharp eyes and commanding presence instantly drawing attention. Her name was Lisa, and she had recently been transferred to this station from another precinct just a few weeks ago. Though still acclimating to the new team, Lisa had quickly proven herself to be someone not to be underestimated. Lisa's gaze swept across the room, taking in the officers engrossed in their work. Her eyes quickly landed on Lisov and Chris Brown, standing by the front desk, engaged in a quiet conversation. There was something about their demeanor that caught Lisa's attention. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her that something was off. "Taylor Smith, Chris Brown," she called out, striding toward them. "What's going on here?" Lisov looked up, surprised to see her. "Not much, ma'am. Just a typical day," he replied casually. Lisa's eyebrows furrowed slightly. Really? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning. A man named Michael Jordan. Lisa tensed slightly but quickly regained his composure. Yes, ma'am, we did. And what's the charge? Lisa asked, her tone calm but probing. Resisting arrest? Lisov replied, his tone steady. We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Was he made aware of his rights? Lysov nodded. Yes, ma'am. Lisa didn't respond immediately. She tilted her head, studying Taylor Smith's face, searching for any hint that he might be lying. She had dealt with officers like him before, those who thought they could bend the rules as long as it served their purpose. But she was different. She had risen through the ranks by following the book, and she expected her team to do the same. Take me to see him, she said finally, her voice firm and leaving no room for argument. Lisov hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. This way, ma'am. As they walked toward the holding cell, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than Lisov was letting on. When they reached Michael's cell, she paused, her eyes fixed on the man inside. Michael sat on the bench, his hands resting calmly on his lap. His posture was oddly relaxed, given the circumstances. There was something about him that made Lisa pause. She turned to Taylor Smith and asked, "This is him?" "Yes, ma'am," Lisov confirmed. "As I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to bring him in." Lisa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened the cell door and stepped inside. Michael looked up at her with calm, steady eyes. There was no fear in his expression, but neither was there defiance. He faced her with composed dignity. "Mr. Jordan," Lisa said evenly, her tone measured. "I'm Lieutenant Lisa Johnson. I'm here to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Lieutenant," Michael replied politely, his voice calm. "I'm happy to cooperate." Lisa nodded, appreciating his composed demeanor. "I've been informed that you resisted arrest, which is why you were brought in. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Michael's steady gaze remained unchanged. "Lieutenant, I did no such thing. I complied with every instruction officers Lisov and Chris Brown gave me. I was heading to my car when they stopped me. I asked why I was being detained, and that simple question seemed to escalate the situation. Before I even understood what was happening." He paused briefly, his voice remaining steady and calm. "I was handcuffed and brought here without a clear explanation. I was handcuffed and charged with resisting arrest, even though I complied with all their instructions," Michael said, his voice calm but resolute. Lisa listened intently, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed Michael's words. There was something in his tone, calm, deliberate, yet underpinned by an undeniable firmness, that caught her attention. Michael wasn't just another man trying to talk his way out of trouble. She turned toward Taylor Smith, who was standing a few feet away. His expression was careful, neutral. "Is that true, Taylor Smith?" Lisa asked, her voice sharpening. "Did he comply with your instructions?" Lisov shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, ma'am," he admitted. "He asked us questions, and things got tense. We had reason to believe he might be hiding something." Lisa's gaze hardened. "And what exactly was that reason?" she asked, her tone razor-sharp. Lisov hesitated, unable to offer a convincing explanation. "It was just a gut feeling, ma'am," he said finally. "A gut feeling?" Lisa repeated, her tone laced with skepticism. "Is that the basis for an arrest?" Lisovo opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of the detention area door swinging open. All eyes turned as Officer Andrew Clark stepped in, looking slightly out of breath. He froze momentarily at the sight of the group gathered near the cell. Realizing he had stepped into a tense situation, Andrew Clark quickly spoke. "Lieutenant, I need to talk to you." He glanced at Michael and Taylor Smith, clearly trying to initiate a private conversation. Lisa shot Taylor Smith one last stern look before turning and stepping out of the cell, closing the door behind her. "What is it, Andrew?" she asked, her tone calm but authoritative. Lowering his voice, Andrew made it clear he wanted to keep the discussion confidential. "Ma'am, I've looked into some information. Michael Jordan isn't just any lawyer. He's a prominent civil rights attorney. He's been involved in several high-profile cases that could make headline news if we mess this up." Andrew paused, locking eyes with Lisa. "There's no way this doesn't turn into a disaster if we're not careful." Lisa felt a pit form in her stomach. She had suspected there was more to this situation then met the eye. But what Andrew was saying raised the stakes higher than she had imagined. "Are you certain?" Andrew nodded and handed her his phone, the screen displaying a webpage detailing Michael's profile. "It's him. If we don't handle this properly, we're going to face far worse than just an internal investigation." Lisa quickly skimmed through the webpage, her eyes widening as she read about Michael's background. He wasn't just a lawyer, he was a powerful figure in the legal community, someone who had taken on police departments, corporations, and government agencies. He's the kind of person who could turn this entire station upside down if we don't act carefully, Andrew said, his voice firm but anxious. Lisa turned back to Taylor Smith, who was still standing near the cell alongside Chris Brown. Both officers looked increasingly uneasy. Lisa knew she had to act swiftly. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she couldn't let it escalate further. "Taylor Smith! Chris Brown!" Lisa called sharply as she walked toward them, her tone carrying an unmistakable warning. "Urgent. We need to talk now." The two officers exchanged nervous glances before following Lisa out of the detention area. Once they reached a more private section of the station, Lisa turned to face them, her expression fierce and unyielding. "Do you realize who you just arrested?" she asked, her voice low but icy. "Michael Jordan is not just some random guy off the street. He's a renowned civil rights attorney, known for taking on cases involving police misconduct." The way she emphasized each word left the two officers in stunned silence, their expressions growing more rigid by the second. "If he decides to file a lawsuit, we're going to be facing some very serious consequences," Lisa continued, her tone cutting. Lisov and Chris Brown exchanged another uneasy glance, clearly beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. Lisa took a deep breath, shaking her head as she resolved to take control of the matter before it spiraled further out of hand. Lisov's face paled, his usual bravado fading rapidly. "Ma'am, we didn't know. He didn't mention anything about being a lawyer." "That doesn't matter," Lisa snapped, her irritation evident. "You should have done your due diligence before bringing him in. Now we need to figure out how to handle this, and fast." As her words hung in the air, the sound of commotion from outside the station began filtering in. Lisa froze, her stomach sinking as she realized what was happening. The crowd outside was growing larger and more vocal. She could now clearly hear the familiar chants of protesters. "Justice for Michael! Free Michael!" "Wonderful," Lisa muttered under her breath. "Exactly what we need right now." Andrew Clark, who had been lingering nearby, stepped forward. "Lieutenant, the community is furious about this. We've got activists, local leaders, and even some media outlets starting to show up. If we don't act soon, this could turn into a full-blown crisis." Lisa knew he was right. She had seen situations like this before, minor incidents spiraling into much larger issues because they weren't handled properly. She nodded, her expression resolute. "We need to make a clear, decisive, and reasonable move. Start identifying who's leading the protest groups outside. Ensure we're communicating transparently. We cannot afford to let this escalate any further," Lisa ordered, her tone firm as she took control of the mounting chaos. But this time it was different. This wasn't just about diffusing tensions. It was about protecting the integrity of the police force and avoiding a legal and public relations nightmare. "We need to act immediately," Lisa said decisively. "Taylor Smith, Chris Brown, I want a full report on the arrest. Detail every step you took and explain your reasoning. I don't care how late we have to stay. Get it done." She turned to Andrew Clark. "Andrew, I need you to help me figure out the best way to handle the media. We need to control the narrative before it spirals out of control." The officers dispersed to carry out her orders, leaving Lisa to face the weight of the situation. She had only been at this precinct for a few weeks, and now she was staring down a potential disaster. But she was determined not to let this destroy her career or tarnish the reputation of the department. Inside the holding cell, Michael remained seated, his mind racing as he listened to the growing noise outside. The voices of the crowd were becoming louder, their chants echoing through the station. He knew his family would be there soon, along with community leaders and activists who had always stood by him. They wouldn't let this go unanswered. A flicker of hope sparked in his chest, but he knew it was too early to feel relief. The police were still in control of the situation, and they could easily manipulate it to their advantage. He had seen it happen before and would not underestimate them. Outside the police station, the tension continued to escalate. The crowd had surrounded the building, carrying signs and banners demanding justice for Michael. The atmosphere was charged, and the growing mass of people showed no signs of backing down. Cameras were trained on the scene, capturing every moment as the police station became a symbol of the growing unrest within the community. Lieutenant Lisa watched the situation unfold from the front window of the station, her jaw clenched in frustration. She knew she had to act, but she was walking a razor's edge. One wrong move and everything could explode. Yet doing nothing would let the situation spiral out of control on its own. Lisa turned to Andrew Clark, who stood beside her, his face no less anxious. "We need to release him," she said finally, her voice taut with tension. "It's the only way to de-escalate this." Andrew nodded in agreement. "But how do we explain it to the media? They're not going to accept us letting him go without an explanation." Lisa thought for a moment before replying. "We'll frame it as a misunderstanding. Say that after reviewing the evidence, we determined there was no basis for the arrest and decided to release him. Emphasize that we take these matters seriously and are committed to justice and fairness." Andrew raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "It's not a perfect solution, but I think it's the best one we've got." Fortunately, the plan was enough to pacify the crowd and prevent the situation from escalating further. Lisa knew this wouldn't be easy, but she had no other choice. She had to consider the bigger picture: the department, her career, and the potential fallout if they didn't handle this correctly. Now, with the world watching, Lisa braced herself to take the next steps, knowing that how she handled this moment would define not just her leadership, but also the trust between the community and the police force. Lisa turned away from the window and walked briskly toward the holding area, determined to resolve the matter before it deteriorated further. As she passed through the office space, she saw Lisov and Chris Brown furiously typing up their reports. She stopped, her eyes cold and sharp. "When this is over, we're going to have a long conversation about what went wrong here," she said icily. "And trust me, it won't be an easy one." Lisov swallowed hard and nodded silently. He knew he was in deep trouble, but for now, all he could do was hope Lisa could manage to untangle this mess with minimal fallout. When Lisa reached Michael's cell, she unlocked the door herself and stepped inside, maintaining a calm and measured demeanor. "Mr. Jordan," she began, her tone steady, "I've reviewed the situation, and it's clear there's been a misunderstanding. You are free to go." Michael stood slowly, his expression cautious. "A misunderstanding, Lieutenant? Is that what we're calling this?" Lisa met his gaze head-on, unwavering and sincere. "Yes. I deeply apologize for what happened today. This should never have escalated to this point." Michael stared at her for a moment, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of deceit. Finally, he nodded. "I appreciate your apology, Lieutenant, but you should know this isn't over." Lisa didn't doubt him for a second. She knew Michael was serious, and she braced herself for what lay ahead. This was far from the end, but she was prepared to face the consequences. Michael walked through the crowd with a calm, unshakable composure. The cheers, the barrage of questions from reporters, none of it fazed him. Camera flashes flickered incessantly, but Michael remained steady, making his way toward his family. His loved ones, faces filled with hope, awaited him. He embraced them, a fleeting moment of safety marking the start of something new. From the front door of the police station, Lisa watched it all. Her gaze was a mix of resolute leadership and a quiet undercurrent of regret. She knew, in this moment, Michael was preparing for a fight not just for himself, but for the values that lay at the foundation of justice. The noise gradually subsided as the crowd began to disperse. Reporters packed up their equipment, and the suffocating tension that had hung over the area eased. Lisa knew her work was far from over. The road ahead would be more challenging and daunting than anything the day had thrown at her, but she remained steadfast, her resolve intact. "Every mistake is a starting point for something better," she whispered to herself as she turned back to face the challenges awaiting her. But Lisa was resolute in facing the challenges ahead head-on. As Michael walked out of the station, his calm gaze said it all. This was merely the beginning of a new battle. He knew he had been treated unjustly, but he also knew how to turn that injustice into strength. The truth would come to light, and when it did, the police department and the entire town would never be the same again. Inside the station, the tension had been palpable since Michael Jordan walked out the front door. Lieutenant Lisa Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Sitting in her office, reviewing the preliminary reports from Lisov and Chris Brown, her thoughts kept circling back to the man they had detained. There was something about the way Michael carried himself, calm, almost as if he expected this, that left her unsettled. She had a strong sense that there was far more to this story than what was currently apparent. Lisa wasn't the kind of person to ignore her instincts. If there was one thing she had learned during her years in law enforcement, it was to trust her intuition, especially when things didn't add up. Outside her office, the station began to return to some semblance of normalcy. The lingering tension kept officers on edge, but the familiar rhythm of routine, the slow settling after a major incident, was beginning to take over. The officers moved about the station, avoiding eye contact with one another, acutely aware of the need for caution. The crowd that had gathered outside earlier had mostly dispersed, but the damage was done. Everyone knew this wasn't going to fade away easily. Lisa leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The silence in her office was a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. She knew she had to dig deeper to understand who Michael Jordan really was and why his arrest had set off such a chain reaction. This couldn't remain an unanswered question, not for her own sake and not for the integrity of the department. Reaching for her computer, Lisa's fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as she searched for more information on Michael. The results were eye-opening. Articles, news stories, and interviews painted the picture of a man who was far more than just a lawyer. Michael Jordan was a formidable force, a civil rights attorney who had gone toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful entities in the country. He had won widely publicized cases and had changed countless lives in the process. Lisa's eyes scanned the headlines. Michael Jordan takes on police misconduct in landmark case. Civil rights attorney wins victory for wrongfully accused. The man fighting for justice across the nation. Each story added layers to the man she had encountered today. He wasn't just someone fighting for himself. He was someone fighting for a cause, and his presence alone had sparked a movement that Lisa could already sense would ripple far beyond this incident. As Lisa skimmed through the information, her eyes narrowed while reading about Michael's most recent case, a high-profile lawsuit against another city's police department. The case had exposed deep-seated corruption, leading to the dismissal of several officers and criminal charges against others. It had been a significant victory for Michael and his team, but it had also painted a target on his back for law enforcement agencies across the country. Digging deeper, Lisa found a detail that sent a chill down her spine. Michael Jordan was involved in a federal investigation into systemic racism within law enforcement. The investigation had already placed several police departments under federal oversight, and there were rumors that many others, including hers, were under close scrutiny. Her heart raced as she absorbed the implications of this discovery. Quickly, Lisa picked up her phone and called a contact at the FBI, someone she trusted to provide accurate information without sensationalizing the matter. The conversation was brief, but as she hung up, Lisa's suspicions were confirmed. Michael Jordan was working undercover. He was gathering evidence for a federal case with the potential to bring down several high-ranking officials within the local law enforcement community, including those in her own department. Lisa sat back in her chair, the weight of her realization pressing down on her. This wasn't just about an isolated incident or a wrongful arrest. Michael's presence here wasn't a coincidence. It was part of a much larger, calculated effort to shine a light on systemic issues within her department and beyond. For the first time, Lisa understood the full gravity of the situation. The question wasn't just how to contain the fallout from today, but how to navigate the inevitable reckoning that was heading straight for her department. Lisa sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This situation was far bigger than she'd imagined. Michael wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd been targeted. The officer's arrest of him had unwittingly sprung a trap. If this got out, it would be a scandal of monumental proportions. Lisa knew she needed to confront Taylor Smith and Chris Brown, but first, she needed more information. Over the next hour, she meticulously pieced together everything she could about Michael, his work, his connections, and the federal investigation. The more she uncovered, the clearer the hidden dangers became. Finally, Lisa stood, taking a deep breath. She was about to walk into a storm, but she had no other choice. This police department couldn't afford to crumble because of the mistakes of a few. She headed toward the main office area, her mind steeled for the confrontation ahead. As she approached Taylor Smith and Chris Brown, they were seated at their desks, reviewing their reports. They looked up as she neared, immediately noticing the tension in her stance. "Lieutenant Lisa," Chris Brown greeted cautiously. "Do you need something?" Lisa crossed her arms, fixing them with a hard stare. "We need to talk. Right now." The two officers exchanged uneasy glances before nodding, clearly aware this wasn't going to be a pleasant discussion. They followed Lisa to an empty conference room, where she closed the door firmly behind them. The room was stark, with only a long table and a few chairs. It was the kind of room where difficult conversations happened, and they had no illusions that this would be any different. "Lieutenant, what's this about?" Chris Brown asked, trying to keep his tone calm, though a trace of nervousness betrayed him. Lisa wasted no time. She looked at them directly, her gaze unwavering. "This is about what happened today," she began, her voice steady but sharp, "and what you failed to see or chose to ignore before making that arrest." Lisa's voice suddenly rose, her tone turning sharp and commanding. "I know who Michael Jordan is." Taylor Smith's eyes widened, and Chris Brown froze, his entire body stiff as if turned to stone. Neither could find the words to respond, but Lisa saw the unmistakable flicker of panic in their eyes. They hadn't realized who they were dealing with, and now that ignorance was coming back to haunt them. "Do you have any idea?" Lisa said, her voice dropping to a dangerously low and deliberate tone. "The mess you've created?" Michael Jordan is a civil rights attorney and a federal asset. He's been working undercover, gathering evidence of corruption within law enforcement, evidence that might implicate this very department. Taylor Smith's face drained of color. "We didn't know, Lieutenant. He didn't say anything about being an undercover agent. We thought he was just what?" Lisa interrupted, her eyes flashing with anger. "Just another black man? Someone you thought you could shove aside without consequences?" Chris Brown flinched, his gaze falling to the floor, unable to meet hers. Taylor Smith, who had been shifting nervously, now stood frozen, his face betraying the realization of what they had done. Lisa opened her mouth, ready to unleash another reprimand, but the words caught in her throat. For a brief moment, she saw something shift in their eyes. Recognition, a dawning awareness of the gravity of their actions. They were beginning to understand that what they had done carried a weight they were wholly unprepared to bear. And for the first time, Lisa saw cracks in their defensive posture, revealing the guilt and fear they had tried to hide. Lisa clenched her jaw, her eyes steeled with determination. "This is a disaster, and it's on you," she said, her voice steady but firm. "With all due respect, Chief," Lisa continued, working to keep her tone calm, "I'm not the only one responsible. Officers Taylor Smith and Chris Brown arrested Michael Jordan without cause, and now we're all paying the price." Chief White's gaze flicked over to Taylor Smith and Chris Brown. His expression hardened. "We'll deal with them later. Right now, we need to focus on damage control." Lisa nodded, maintaining her composure. "I've already started assessing the situation. There's an ongoing federal investigation into systemic racism in law enforcement. This investigation has led to federal oversight of local police departments, and Michael Jordan has been gathering evidence for that case. If we don't handle this carefully, it could destroy us all." The fury on Chief White's face was unmistakable, but he kept his temper in check. "What's our next move?" Before Lisa could respond, there was a knock on the door. It opened to reveal a young officer, his face pale with unease. "Lieutenant, someone's here to see you," the officer stammered. "He says it's urgent." Chief White frowned, his eyebrows drawing together. "Who is it?" "A federal agent," the officer replied nervously. "His name is Williams." Lisa clenched her jaw, her eyes blazing with determination. "This is a disaster, and it's on you." "With all due respect, Chief," Lisa said, trying to maintain her composure, "I'm not the only one responsible. Officers Taylor Smith and Chris Brown arrested Michael Jordan without cause, and now we're all paying the price." Chief White's gaze shifted to Taylor Smith and Chris Brown. His expression hardened. "We'll deal with them later. Right now, our focus needs to be on damage control." Lisa nodded, her demeanor professional and steady. "I've started assessing the situation. There's an active federal investigation into systemic racism in law enforcement. This investigation has already resulted in federal oversight of local departments, and Michael Jordan has been gathering evidence for it. If we don't manage this carefully, it could destroy us all." The anger on Chief White's face was evident, but he kept himself composed. "What's our next step?" Before Lisa could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. It opened slightly, and a young officer peeked in, looking visibly uneasy. "Lieutenant, someone's here to see you," the officer stammered. "He says it's urgent." Chief White frowned deeply. "Who is it?" "A federal agent," the officer replied nervously. "His name is Williams." The room sank into a heavy silence as the officer's announcement settled in. Lisa exchanged a tense glance with Chief Daniels, both acutely aware that the moment they had dreaded was now upon them. Daniels maintained a composed but firm tone as he gave instructions, and the young officer nodded quickly before disappearing down the hallway. Moments later, the door swung open, and Special Agent David Williams stepped in. He was a tall man radiating authority, with a stern face and air of command that immediately drew all eyes to him. His perfectly tailored dark suit, complemented by the gleaming badge at his waist, reflected the harsh fluorescent light, leaving no question as to his identity or purpose. "Chief Daniels, Lieutenant Lisa, Special Agent Williams," he introduced himself curtly, his sharp gaze sweeping across the room. "We need to talk." Daniels straightened, visibly working to maintain control. "Agent Williams, I believe we can explain." Williams raised a hand, cutting him off. "No need for explanations," he replied coldly. "I'm fully aware of what happened here. Let me be clear. This is an extremely serious matter." Lisa felt her heartbeat quicken as she observed the agent. There was no mistaking the gravity in his voice. Whatever was about to unfold, she knew it would change everything. "Michael Jordan," Williams continued, his words deliberate, "is a critical asset in a months-long federal investigation. His arrest was a mistake that could have far-reaching consequences if not handled properly." Daniels shifted slightly, the tension etched across his face. "We understand, Agent Williams. We're prepared to cooperate fully." "Good," Williams responded, his tone icy, "because at this moment your cooperation is the only thing preventing this situation from escalating further." Each word he spoke cut through the already tense atmosphere like a blade. Lisa realized that another misstep wouldn't just worsen the situation. It could push them all into an abyss from which there might be no return. Lisa's mind spun as she tried to grasp the full gravity of the situation. This was no longer just about Michael Jordan. It had escalated into an issue for the entire department, for the whole city. And if they didn't tread carefully, everything could collapse like a sandcastle before a surging tide. Williams' gaze turned steely as he spoke, his deep, commanding voice resonating through the room. "We will issue a formal apology to him on behalf of the department. Any resistance to this order will be met with swift and decisive action." Daniel's face flushed red with anger, but all he could do was give a stiff nod. "Understood." Williams turned to Lisa, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant, I expect you to personally oversee this. Make sure no further mistakes are made." Lisa nodded, her throat dry. "I'll handle it." Williams gave a slight nod and turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, he stopped, glancing over his shoulder to add, his tone dropping to something dangerously low. "Consider this a warning. The federal government is watching closely. Any misconduct in this department will not be tolerated." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the room in stunned silence. Lisa felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders, the air growing heavier by the minute. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with risks, but she also understood that she had no choice but to face it and navigate through the storm. The atmosphere at the police station grew even more tense as the day wore on. The morning's events had triggered a chain reaction no one could have foreseen. News of Michael Jordan's wrongful arrest spread like wildfire. igniting outrage not just within the community, but across the entire city. Outside the station, protests erupted. Activists, community leaders, and furious citizens gathered, chanting demands for justice. The streets were flooded with people, their presence exerting immense pressure on the walls of the police department. Inside, every officer felt the heat of the situation, acutely aware that any misstep could fan the flames that had been smoldering all day. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The anger and discontent from the community pressed down on them with every passing moment. But she knew the responsibility of resolving this now rested squarely on her shoulders, and she couldn't afford to let it spiral out of control. Police Chief Robert White was struggling to salvage his reputation. He knew the police department stood on the brink of a public relations disaster. Years of simmering community anger had now erupted into an uncontrollable blaze. A public apology was necessary, but deep down, he understood it might not be enough to extinguish the raging fire. In his office, Daniels sat frozen at his desk, his gaze fixed on the phone in front of him. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up and dialed the number for the public relations team. He was acutely aware that they needed a statement, a message that conveyed commitment and seriousness about the situation. Yet, no matter how polished the words, Daniels knew deep down that they could never fully repair the damage they had caused. When the line connected, Daniels spoke, his voice heavy and somber. "I need you to draft a public apology. We'll be addressing the media outside the station this afternoon." "Understood?" "Understood, Chief. We'll get on it right away," came the reply from the other end. Daniels hung up and leaned back in his chair. He ran a hand through his graying hair, feeling the weight of his decisions pressing heavily on his shoulders. Years of compromise, of turning a blind eye to the misconduct of officers like Lisa and Chris Brown, now haunted him. He had once told himself it was part of the job, that sometimes to maintain order, you had to look the other way. But now he realized those compromises had only made things worse. A knock at the door interrupted Daniel's thoughts. "Come in," he called out, his voice hoarse and weary. The door opened to reveal a young officer, his face etched with worry. "Chief, the protesters outside are growing more restless. The media has also gathered in full force." Daniels nodded and rose to his feet. He knew this moment would be a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire department. One small misstep could unravel every effort to contain the situation. Taking a deep breath, Daniels stepped out of his office, heading toward a press conference he knew would be the greatest challenge of his career. Lieutenant Lisa Johnson stood at the door, her face tense but her eyes resolute. She spoke, her voice steady. "Chief Michael Jordan is waiting outside, along with the crowd." Daniels nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "I'll go out there and apologize." Lisa hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her eyes filled with concern. "Chief, there's something I need to tell you before you go out there." Daniels raised an eyebrow, scrutinizing her. "What is it, Lisa?" She took a deep breath, then uttered the words she knew would change everything. "I've uncovered evidence of systemic corruption within the department. Bribery, cover-ups, and racial discrimination. This investigation isn't just about Lisa and Chris Brown. It's been going on for years and has been kept under wraps." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. He stared at her, his voice almost a whisper. "Are you sure?" Lisa nodded firmly. "I've started gathering evidence with the help of Michael Jordan and the federal oversight team. We can begin cleaning up this mess, but I won't lie to you. It's going to be a long and incredibly difficult process." Daniels exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging as though bearing the weight of the world. He nodded, his expression conflicted but resolute. "Then, we'll do what needs to be done. It's time to face the consequences of our past actions." Lisa gave a small nod of agreement. "I'll stand beside you out there, Chief. We need to show the community that we're serious about making a change." Daniels didn't reply, but his eyes spoke volumes. He understood that this was no longer about saving face. It was a fight for survival. If they didn't act now, the entire department could be dismantled, and their legacy would be forever remembered as a cautionary tale of failure and injustice. Together, they stepped out of the office, heading toward the door that led outside. As they approached, the noise of the crowd grew louder. Angry voices, chanting for justice. For accountability. Daniels glanced at Lisa, who gave him a reassuring nod. The two of them stepped through the door, facing the storm of outrage from the community, ready to begin a journey they knew would be grueling. But they also understood that it was the only path to saving not just the honor of the department, but the trust of a community that had suffered too long under the weight of injustice. Daniels felt a dull ache in his chest, though it wasn't merely anxiety. Despite the storm of emotions churning inside him, he maintained a composed expression as he pushed open the door and stepped into the glaring sunlight. A wave of silence swept over the crowd the moment they saw him. Cameras began flashing rapidly, reporters jostled for position, and microphones were thrust forward amidst a cacophony of voices. But Daniels ignored it all. His eyes fixed on the podium set up in the middle of the courtyard, where all attention now converged. Among the crowd, he caught a glimpse of Michael Jordan. His expression was as stoic as stone, betraying no emotion, yet his presence was undeniably the focal point. Daniels took a deep breath, cleared his throat, and walked slowly toward the microphone. He could feel the eyes of hundreds of people boring into him, their judgment, suspicion, and anger hanging thick in the air. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice deep but tense, just loud enough to cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "I want to start by acknowledging what happened this morning. The arrest of Mr. Michael Jordan was a grave mistake, one that should never have occurred." His words sparked a ripple of whispers among the crowd. Doubts and indignation mingled in the murmuring voices, spreading like wildfire. Yet Daniels held firm, gripping the edge of the podium to steady himself. "I take full responsibility for what happened," he continued, his tone steady but heavy with the weight of accountability. "I have listened, and I want to offer my sincerest apology to Mr. Jordan and to this entire community." A wave of emotion swept through the crowd. Some faces softened, but most remained tense and skeptical. Daniels could feel the pressure mounting with each passing second, the weight of decades of injustice and distrust pressing down on him. "We acknowledge that this incident is not an isolated mistake," he said, his voice growing darker. "It is part of a larger problem, one that has persisted far too long within our police department. I want to assure all of you that we are committed to addressing these issues head-on." Daniels paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, now hanging on his every word. "Effective immediately, Officers Lisa and Chris Brown have been suspended pending an internal investigation. We will conduct a comprehensive review of our operations and procedures, and we will work closely with federal oversight to ensure our police department meets the highest standards of accountability." The crowd fell silent. Daniel's words seemed to cool the flames of anger, though only just enough to contain them. He knew this was just the beginning of a long journey to rebuild trust. Daniels lifted his head, his eyes filled with determination. "I know that no words can undo the damage that has been done, but I promise you this: we will not shy away from responsibility. We will correct these wrongs, not through words, but through real action." His final words rang out with resolve in the hushed courtyard. Stepping back from the podium, his eyes met Michael Jordan's in the crowd. Michael gave a subtle nod, a small yet profound gesture. Daniels understood that this wasn't just a promise to the community. It was a commitment to himself as well. Below, the crowd remained tense, but the atmosphere had shifted. For the first time in years, a faint glimmer of hope emerged amidst the sea of anger. Daniels knew that hope was fragile, but he was ready to fight to preserve it. Daniels could see the doubt in the eyes of the crowd. It was the weariness born of years of empty promises and hollow declarations. He took a deep breath, steadying his voice even as it wavered slightly. "I know that words alone are not enough," Daniels admitted, his tone heavy with remorse. "We have a long road ahead to rebuild the trust that has been lost. But I want you to know that we are committed to making the necessary changes. We will work with community leaders, activists, and organizations to create a police force that serves and protects everyone, regardless of race or background." He paused, searching for the right words to conclude his statement. But before he could continue, Michael Jordan stepped forward, raising his hand to stop him. "Chief Daniels," Michael said, his voice calm yet resolute, "I appreciate your apology, but this is not just about words. What we need is action. Real justice is not just a public apology. It requires real change, real accountability, and a real commitment. Daniels nodded and slowly stepped away from the microphone. He knew Michael was right. The apology was only the beginning. The real work lay ahead. Michael turned to face the crowd, his presence magnetic, drawing every eye to him. He scanned the sea of faces, his own filled with determination and conviction. "We've heard apologies before," Michael began, his voice clear and resonant. "But what we need now is a commitment to true, lasting change. We need to hold those in power accountable for their actions, and we need to work together to build a system that treats everyone with fairness and respect." Scattered applause broke out in the crowd, gradually swelling into a thunderous wave. Michael's words cut through the anger and frustration that had festered for years. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Michael continued, his voice strong and impassioned. "This is about all of us, about everyone who has ever been treated unjustly by a system that should have protected them, about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I've endured. And most importantly, this is about making sure that justice is not just a word on paper, but a living, breathing reality." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the air. Michael paused, letting the energy of the moment settle into him. He looked around, seeing in the faces of those gathered not just anger, but also a flicker of hope. Hope for a fairer future. Hope that the words spoken today would become actions tomorrow. And hope that this time, things would truly be different. In the eyes of the crowd, Michael saw a powerful yearning, a longing for something better, something fairer. It was a force he knew he could not ignore. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Michael said, his tone now calm yet profoundly resonant. "It takes time, effort, and all of us working together, but I believe we can do it. I believe we can build a better future, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come." Applause thundered across the gathering, accompanied by cheers of affirmation. Michael stepped down from the podium, his message leaving a lasting impression. The crowd's support felt like a wave of renewed determination pushing him forward. He knew this was only the beginning of a long and arduous journey, but he was ready, ready to lead the fight for justice, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that the voices of the marginalized would no longer go unheard. As Michael walked through the crowd, he was met with embraces from friends and supporters. Lieutenant Lisa stood on the steps of the police station, observing the scene with mixed emotions. A part of her felt relief. The immediate crisis had been temporarily controlled. Yet at the same time, a rising determination stirred within her. Lisa knew the police department had an incredibly long road ahead. But with leaders like Michael Jordan at the forefront, she believed they could make it. Lisa turned to Chief Daniels, who was still standing by the podium. His expression was a blend of exhaustion and resolve. "We've got a lot of work to do," she said quietly. Daniels nodded, his gaze still on the dispersing crowd. "Yes, we do, but we'll get through this." As the crowd began to thin, Lisa noticed a lone figure lingering at the edge of the gathering. The man was tall, dressed in a dark suit, and carried an air of quiet authority. His eyes were fixed on Michael, his expression unreadable. Curious, Lisa approached the man. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man turned to face her, his sharp eyes focused and intense. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Jordan," he replied, his voice low and deliberate, each word carefully measured. "I have a message for him." Lisa frowned, scrutinizing him more closely. Something about the man set her on edge, a feeling she couldn't quite place. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously. The man smiled faintly, but the warmth never reached his eyes. "Just someone with an interest in seeing justice served," he said. Before Lisa could press further, the man turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with an inexplicable sense of unease. Someone like him, with his enigmatic presence and ambiguous words, was not someone she could dismiss lightly. But the most pressing question remained unanswered. What did he truly want? The man turned back, moving toward Michael before disappearing quickly into the crowd. Lisa watched him go, the unease in her chest growing heavier. Whoever he was, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the steps of the police station. Lisa stood there, feeling the cool breeze brush against her, carrying with it a mix of exhaustion and hope. The day's events, chaotic and tense as they were, marked only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and the road ahead promised to be fraught with challenges. But for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this time, they could begin to right the wrongs and make things right. Elsewhere in the city, in a small community center, an important meeting was underway. Michael Jordan sat at the head of a large table, surrounded by a diverse group: community leaders, activists, legal experts, and concerned citizens. The atmosphere in the room was both lively and serious, with individuals voicing their thoughts on the Community Justice Initiative. "We need to focus on education," Emma Garcia, a high school teacher, said passionately. "If we want lasting change, we have to start with the youth." "I agree," said Dr. Henry Wilson, a sociology professor from the City University. "But we can't ignore the immediate needs of those who are currently suffering injustices. A multifaceted approach is essential." Michael listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. He felt inspired by the passion and expertise in the room. This was exactly what he had hoped for: a collaborative effort, harnessing the power of the entire community. As the discussion progressed, they began crafting concrete plans, establishing a legal aid clinic, offering free representation for those who couldn't afford it, ensuring they wouldn't be abandoned by the legal system, creating a community oversight board, working alongside the police department's internal affairs division to improve transparency and accountability, implementing educational programs, focusing on civic rights, community engagement, and conflict resolution skills for students and residents at community centers. The meeting ran longer than expected, but as it concluded, no one in the room felt weary. Instead, they were energized and determined. They knew the road ahead would be long, but the first steps had been taken, steps that could lead to real change. Michael stepped out of the community center, feeling the cool evening air against his skin. He looked up at the sky, now transitioning to the deep hues of night, his heart filled with hope. He knew this journey wouldn't be easy, but with passionate and dedicated people by his side, he believed that one day true justice could become a reality. The first steps had been taken, and as weeks turned into months, the city began to witness small but significant changes. Under the supervision of Lieutenant Lisa Johnson and the newly formed Community Oversight Board, the police department implemented training programs focusing on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Officers like Andrew Clark, who genuinely sought to improve, were given opportunities to work directly with community leaders and social workers, helping to bridge the gap between the police and the people they served. Meanwhile, the Community Justice Initiative began to take root. Their legal aid clinic handled dozens of cases, providing representation to individuals who had been wrongfully arrested or mistreated. Educational programs were piloted in several schools, with plans to expand citywide, aiming to foster civic awareness and conflict resolution skills among the youth. Perhaps the most profound change, however, wasn't in the initiatives themselves, but in the city's atmosphere. A new sense of collective ownership emerged, an understanding that addressing long-standing issues required everyone's participation. Neighborhood patrol groups now worked closely with the police to enhance safety without relying on racially biased practices. Regular community dialogues provided spaces for open conversations between residents and local officials, building trust that had long been eroded. Of course, progress wasn't without its challenges. Misconduct still occurred, and there were moments of tension and skepticism. Change was a slow process, and resistance appeared at every turn. Yet what set this moment apart was the establishment of systems designed to address these challenges, hold people accountable, and push for continued progress. While the road was long and far from perfect, the city had begun to move forward, one step at a time, fueled by a shared determination to build a more just and equitable future. 6 months after the event that sparked it all, Michael Jordan returned to the police station. This time, he wasn't a suspect or a victim, but a collaborator. He had been invited to speak at a training session for new recruits, sharing his perspective to help shape the next generation of police officers. As he walked through the hallways, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the changes within the station. The atmosphere was as busy as ever, but there was a newfound openness that hadn't been there before. Officers greeted him with respectful nods. Some even stopped to shake his hand. At the entrance to the training room, Lieutenant Lisa Johnson waited for him. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Jordan," she said, extending her hand. "I think your perspective will be incredibly valuable for these recruits." Michael shook her hand, noting the genuine warmth in her expression. "I'm glad to be here," he replied with a sincere smile. "And please, call me Michael." They stepped into the room where rows of young faces turned to look at him. Some eyes were filled with curiosity, while others held a hint of wariness. Michael understood their hesitation. He represented a challenge to the way things had always been. Taking a deep breath, he felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He knew the words he was about to say could leave a lasting impact, not only on these recruits, but on the future of the police department itself. Standing before them, Michael was acutely aware of the importance of the journey he was on, a long, challenging path that had now begun with hopeful, meaningful first steps. That morning, Michael stood before the young recruits, individuals who represented the future of the police force. In their eyes, he saw curiosity mixed with a touch of skepticism, but above all, he recognized the potential for real change. "Good morning," Michael began, his voice calm and steady. "My name is Michael Jordan, and today I'm here to talk to you about justice. Not just the kind of justice you'll swear to uphold, but the kind that goes beyond badges and courtrooms, the kind that's about how you treat people, with respect and dignity." As Michael spoke, he shared his experiences and the deep insights he'd gained. He recounted his journey, the mistakes that had been made, and the importance of never ceasing to learn. His words seemed to resonate as he watched the recruits listen intently, ask thoughtful questions, and engage in discussions with respect and openness. After the session, as Michael was gathering his notes, one of the recruits approached him. She was a young woman, barely out of her teens, with determination written plainly on her face. "Mr. Jordan," she said, her voice slightly hesitant, "I just wanted to thank you for coming today. I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference, to help people. But after everything that's happened, I started questioning if I made a mistake. Hearing you speak today, it reminded me why I'm here." Michael smiled, deeply moved by her sincerity. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sophia Davis," she replied. "Sophia," Michael said, his gaze warm and genuine. "I'm so glad you're here. This department needs people like you, people who want to make a difference, who are willing to ask questions and keep learning. Don't ever lose that spirit." As Sophia walked away, Michael felt a surge of hope rise within him. He understood that it was people like her who would determine whether the changes they were fighting for would truly endure. That evening, Michael sat in his office at the Community Justice Initiative, reviewing case files and reports. The work seemed endless, but he felt deeply fulfilled. Every small victory, every life improved, made the long hours and sleepless nights worthwhile. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Michael looked up to see Emma Garcia, the teacher who had been instrumental in developing the initiative's educational programs. "Michael," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "I just got out of a meeting with the school board. They approved our curriculum for all high schools in the district." Michael stood, a bright smile spreading across his face. "That's fantastic news, Emma. Your hard work has truly paid off." Emma smiled back, but her expression soon turned more serious. "It's all of our hard work, Michael. None of this would have happened without you, without everything you've been through." Michael shook his head, his gaze earnest. "I may have been the catalyst, but this movement is so much bigger than me. It's about all of us, working together to create the change we want to see." They spent the next hour discussing the details of rolling out the curriculum. When the conversation ended, Michael felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This, he thought, is what real change looks like: a collective effort, working together, building together, and creating the future everyone deserves. It wasn't the protests or the rousing speeches that defined the community's future, but the concrete actions taken to create lasting change. The first steps had been taken, and though the road ahead was long, the light of hope illuminated every path they had chosen. That night, as Michael finally returned home, he paused for a moment outside his office. The streets were quiet, the city bathed in the stillness of the night. Michael looked up at the sky, where stars glittered against the deep blue canvas. He thought about what they had achieved over the past 6 months, the small yet significant changes, and the challenges still awaiting them. A sense of peace washed over him. They were on the right path, and he knew it. Yes, there would be setbacks along the way. There would be moments when it felt like everything was starting over. But as long as they continued to move forward, as long as they worked together, they could build the community they all dreamed of, a place where justice was not just a word, but a living, breathing reality for everyone. With renewed determination, Michael began to walk, his steady footsteps echoing in the quiet night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But he was ready to face them all, one step at a time, with a heart full of hope and an unshakable resolve. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to my channel. Stories like this are crafted with all my heart and dedication, and your support would mean so much to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.